At this point, I'd like to thank you, first of all, for inviting me to speak to you here today. And this is also an honor to speak to you today. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, dear guests, thank you for your warm welcome. CONVOCO will be dealing with two central topics that we're all concerned with: failure and uncertainty. But I'd like to pick up on one thing to begin with. Let's start with failure. It's not a very nice topic. Nobody is happy to fail. But failure, we've all experienced this. This is part of our day-to-day life. In business as well. I'm sure you're familiar with creative destruction. If you take a look at the most important stock amounts, you will see this 1975 when Standard & Poor's 500 was assigned. Now we only have 57 of them that are still on the exchange. Nearly 90% of them have been able to hold on to this very famous situation. Of the 30 back in 1988 that were on the DAX 30, now only 18 still belong. Of the 11 of the 50 MDAX companies, that is to say those that were there to begin with, only those 11 companies have maintained that position. So statistically, I'm very impressed by this. For decades now, and if you can assume that this accounts that for 75 years, to be on these indices, today there are only about 10 years that they remain there. But the average age of all Western European countries is only 12.3 years. So failure is part of our day-to-day business, and we know why. Companies fail, especially if I say if you don't change, you will disappear. That sounds rather drastic, but that's the truth. Companies fail because their products no longer fit with the times. They don't want to focus on their core technologies. Raw materials become too expensive. Other factors have changed, etc. There are many, many other reasons which I could mention here today, but one thing is for sure. Not all companies fail, thank goodness. And many manage to cope with the changes and to use this for new growth. That's why there's a second reason why companies fail. Companies fail very clearly because their managers rest on their laurels for too long. They're too arrogant in some cases, and sometimes they don't have enough courage or creativity to change, and they are not able to change their way of thinking. And that's exactly what forms the interface to the second term, uncertainty. If you could predict change, then it would be quite easy to react to it. And if you make mistakes, these would only be smaller mistakes. So that's why I'd like to turn to this point now. I will be brief, and this is a very personal point. I'd like to pick up on 5 topics to link uncertainty, strategy, and management. First of all, in my opinion here is that I've developed over the last 20 years, the requirements placed on management have increased considerably because the environment has become much more complex. This is often counted. People say it is not true. The world was complex in the past as well, so the requirements to management were high as well because there have always been major changes. We're all familiar with this, the Industrial Revolution, the 68 revolution, the 1968, or the oil shock in the 1970s, or another aspect is that communication is not as it is today. Everything can occur at our fingertips today, but information, and there were asymmetries that existed there. But that's all not the case. I think we're confronted with a development today which really implements and affects planning in our lives. It makes it very difficult. Uncertainty. Uncertainty is characterized, in my opinion, by the fact that we don't know what could happen, nor do we know how probable something is. Uncertainty is very clearly differentiated from risks or insecurities. These are two terms that we're all familiar with. Risk is there when a number of possibilities are there, but they have different probabilities. You can see the Gaussian normal distribution. There are a number of different possibilities, but they are known, and you can calculate the probabilities, and you can calculate which would be the better decision and which would be more probable. With insecurity, of course, a number of events are possible, but you don't know what the probability is, or it's very hard to calculate them. You can see different risks that come together. We noticed this in the financial crisis. Extrapolations and continuations of trends are only possible to a certain extent, and the causal relationship between them is something that you don't know until after the fact. But still, there is an idea of what could be with uncertainty, and that is the difference which actually leads us to complexity. Here, it's not only a lack of knowledge as to the probability of occurrence, we don't even know what possibilities might occur. Developments are no longer linear, neither in terms of probability, the direction, nor the speed. None of this can be predicted. So quantitative models, and that's what I grew up with, and I'm speaking to you on personal terms here, as I said. That's why quantitative models don't really help us out anymore. We have to come up with other possibilities. And let me quote something here just to show you that this is no longer as up-to-date as presented. John Maynard Keynes, and he wrote in the early 1930s, quantitative comparisons are no good. Small changes can lead to major effects and assumptions that we are all subjected to if you assume a continuous development is not correct. So this means in management, we're faced with this on a day-to-day position. Put yourself in the position of a management, the strategy team, a consultant who is developing a strategy. Let's be honest, only 10 years ago, would we have thought that the Internet would have such an impact on retail trade and the media as it actually has had? Or that green technologies would really mean that we would no longer depend on nuclear energy? Or that China would be the largest exporter? Or that we would have other developments in the U.S.? Or that fracking would also be something that would turn the energy markets upside down. And this is also something that talks about the competitiveness of the U.S. industry going up and up. And a lot of the growth forecasts we had are no longer correct, as well as other strategies as well. I can give you lots of examples for these new, at least new to me. These are unexpected, unpredictable developments or forecasts which become obsolete very quickly. I could go on, and I could quote Karl Valentin, and I said, even the future isn't what it used to be. But if these examples show us one thing, then this is how contradictory they are. And management deal with these in different ways. What I'm talking about is the following. As managers, we of course know that we live in a complex world and that the future is uncertain. But the people in our company, and this is a very important point for me that I'll come back to in just a minute on, but the people in our companies have an increasing need for security, and this is something we need to address even when we talk about strategy. We know from experience that we cannot depend on trends and figures. That doesn't help us. We still have to plan, calculate, and take decisions. And as Corinna said, we live in a complex world, and we need interdisciplinary thinking in order to cope with these problems. And nonetheless, in our companies, we need excellent knowledge in terms of practical experience and factual knowledge. In my opinion, these contradictions cannot be eliminated by strategies, but they are associated with good news. Management becomes more direct, more personal, and more entrepreneurial. They can't hide behind ideas and models or consultants. What we need is courage, personality, and the ability to reflect on things. You need to be able to take a position, and you also have to be convicted. I think that is the best reaction to uncertainty. Now, if you can follow me for just a minute, let's assume that I am right. Then, of course, that also means that all of these strategies and plans that you're all familiar with, I'm sure, we will have to rethink all of this, because if we're confronted with uncertainty, it doesn't make much sense to calculate a 10-year plan or investment plans to be based on quantitative calculations. No, we need to come up with new approaches and new ways of thinking, and we have to think about the strategic ideas and concepts. There was never a lack of any of that. In the early 90s, that is when I began my career, this was diversification that was in then. A company has a number of different businesses to diversify the risk. And up until today, works councils are asking themselves whether this was a clever strategy or not. And then they focused on core competence, as we called it back then, with all different terms, re-engineering, transformation. Maybe you're familiar with that, the magic triangle, time, cost, and quality, and everything was to be optimized at the same time. And in the new economy, it was then a question of the deconstruction of the value change that determined our way of thinking. Then we went back to focusing on core competence, and today we talk about diversification. And from all of this, return to what we had in the past. They can draw strategies that these are all subject to fads, and these are developed by the consultants in order to do business. Maybe I'm not being objective here, but I don't think this is correct, because each of these concepts, if you take a careful look at them, they were valid at certain points of time, and they worked at certain points of times. But the problem today is that the stable underlying conditions no longer exist. To develop a strategy means that we have to recognize when a concept is no longer valid, and you have to have the courage to go against the mainstream or go against the public way of thinking. And it's even more difficult to return to an old way of thinking if you think that is better than what you have today. And when we talk about shareholder value concepts, I haven't mentioned all of them yet, but for me, it was important for Jack Welch, the former CEO at General Electric. He was one of the most important protagonists in the American shareholder value idea. And at the peak of the financial crisis, he said, on the face of it, shareholder value is the dumbest idea in the world. It's the result of the strategy. What really counts are your employees, your customers, and your products. I think he is right. And this is something that speaks in favor of us. This American shareholder value is something that we didn't always go along with. We always had an understanding of stakeholder value. But it's not all that simple, as Jack Welch put it, because even if what he says is correct, that the success of companies, of course, will depend on motivated individuals, enthusiastic customers, and superior products, we still have to answer the following question. How will we achieve this, and how will we put this in the proper strategy? So the problem that I mentioned at the beginning continues to exist. It's just been defined in a different way, because if trends are no longer reliable, then the figures will no longer help us reliably, because what will this analysis, how will this help us? I really liked all of this, but when we talk about the future cash flow, if we see that this is no longer certain, if the figures don't help us anymore, then we need a feeling for technologies, customer requirements, and social developments. I would like to quote Albert Einstein, who, in a different context, said something that was very appropriate here as well. Sometimes what counts cannot be counted, and what can be counted doesn't count. These are things that I think that we, or at least I can say for myself, this is things that we have experienced again and again. People in our companies, with the complexity, as I mentioned before, they feel uncertain, insecure, and it's a reaction to the uncertainty. Then the trust in their abilities is something which is very important. That's what plays a decisive role. This is a very important point for me, because I think that, very personally speaking, a reaction to uncertainty, each and every one of us, it applies to me in particular, what we want is security. We want a secure income, certain prospects and the future that you want. In the past, and that was my comment at the very beginning, it was simpler, or easier anyway, to find certainty and to react to this because many of us have also done this. We could stand up in front of our teams and say, this is our strategy, these are our measures, these are our goals, and this is what we want to achieve. And because the underlying conditions were somewhat stable, we had an opportunity to say that we will manage this, and we were credible, and in this way we could give them security and reduce complexity. If you allow me to give you a symbol for this search for security and the contradictions that are related thereto, we take a look at the organizational charts in different companies. We've known for many years now, and that was the topic in the 1990s. Companies have to be process-oriented to react in a flexible way. Flexibility, it's not only a question of the structures, but in every company you will still find an organizational chart with boxes and lines and names. You will find that at Roland Berger as well, because it promises you a position and it gives you a feeling of security. And let me tell you one thing, I'm really quite happy that there is a box with my name in it. This gives me a feeling of security. But the problem is, however, that we no longer can say that these boxes will remain. That was different in the past. Just like the figures that were planned that I mentioned before. What we need is new elements that will give us the security we want. And in my opinion, this will only be achieved. They cannot be instruments, but this can be the personalities of our managers, because nobody can simply hide behind a figure or a plan. If someone really wants to be a manager, he has to be able to explain what his convictions are and what his vision of the future is. So that means what we're concerned with here is to have a broad horizon and also to have the courage to disclose what it is. We've heard that if you talk about your vision, you are giving away the limits to your horizon, which I'm doing right now in front of you today. And we all know that this requires courage to talk about a vision for the future. But I don't think it will be possible without doing so. So developing strategies in uncertain times faces us with a dilemma. The strategy has to be robust enough so it has an element of stability so people can be in favor of it and you can manage your people with them. And at the same time, it has to be flexible enough. You have to have certain things that are defined definitely to the far future. We can give you stability, and we don't want to lose any momentum. So we need three things. First of all, you need a strategic core. In other words, you have to be able to take positions, and this would define your company. So then you can have orientation within and to the outside world. Bosch, for example, has three pillars: technology, international business, and sustainability. Sustainability, not only for these three pillars, but also in their impact. And I'd like to put it this way, because I think this really calmed things down considerably during the crisis. And this can refer to the basic principles and abide by your basic principles, and also for other companies as well. Bosch has its technology and innovation. They invested there, and they made it very clear that there is a strategic core. And this is something which is also the role in strategy consultants' strategy. Top management advice. This changes on a continuing basis. We're dynamic, and maybe you've read about that. Our markets are volatile. Our clients are more experienced. Others try to attack our markets and to grow here. But nonetheless, there is a core which is the distinguishing factor of our company. I'm not trying to advertise my company, but there are examples of strategic cores that are hard to get a handle on, but you know exactly what it is, and that means that they can give you a certain amount of orientation. The second point, which is important to me when we're talking about strategy and uncertainty, is the strategic core. It has to be defended, of course, and what you need for that is a certain amount of elasticity. they often speak of organizational slack, and they mean this in a positive way. We're talking about an excess of resources, people, capital, and skills, which you don't need for your day-to-day business, but which will help you to come up with new ideas and innovation and to buffer risks. Organizational slack has undergone a change when it came to Europe, because slack is a negative term and it needs to be eliminated. It is not associated with the German term efficiency. And I think now we can say that we were exaggerating things with efficiency. Maybe we did not really think about it in a long-term sense. But if you want to be resistant and you want to have an opportunity, then you need resources. They need to think about new ideas. You might need a different capital structure. You might also need functions which are simply there to create creativity. I'm not pleading for too much. It's a challenge. You have to determine how much of this organizational slack is necessary in order to have this efficiency. So there are 2 points that I've dealt with: the strategic core and the willingness to have organizational slack. But there's a third one as well, and that's the one that's most important to me, and that's why it took me so long to get here. What we're talking about is to counter insecurity by being able to recognize change and to react to change. And I think that that is the main responsibility that top management has. What else should they do? They have to recognize change and also help companies to go through this. But this is where we find the most important errors. Early warning signals for market or technological changes are often not perceived. And in some cases, these are simply not looked at. We also have political impacts, and these are often underestimated. Market changes, customer changes that are not really perceived. And if there are tangible changes, this is something that we experience again and again. It's more a question of actionism rather than trying to change something. None of this is surprising to us. I think we've all experienced this. And the findings, this is nothing new. It's not a change that leads to failure, but it's the inability to recognize it in due time and to be courageous and react to it. This reminds me of something that I've talked about. It's Barbara Tuchman's remarkable analysis of the mistakes made by the governing parties. From Troya to Vietnam, the strategic incorrect decisions, not because of a lack of knowledge or information, but simply decision makers who were a failure because of themselves or the underlying conditions. Many have failed as a result of that. My conclusion to be drawn from this is that the actual response to dealing with uncertainty is that you have to be different and better, and maybe seeing this with a different personality. It's not a question of hiding behind concepts. It's not a question of hiding behind figures. Management will only work, and it reflects uncertainty, if you come closer to the people, you come closer to your technologies and your customers, if you are more entrepreneurial. But entrepreneurial, we talk about entrepreneurship, this does not suffice either. And if you really want to counter uncertainty, then this entrepreneurship has to be combined with the ability to reflect on things, to be open to different worlds and different cultures. So what we need, and this brings us back to our subject, we need more interdisciplinarity. What's really important, in my opinion, is to deal with uncertainty, and this is a much better link than we have today between natural and economic ways of thinking. That's a strategy. How do you manage your people? How do you get competitive edges? This has to be combined with thinking about how growth works. These are questions that we've dealt with considerably. What models are behind it? What limits does it have? We have to combine this with geopolitical ideas. What regions will be very strong? How can we deal with all of this? This combined with social thinking. In other words, what values will impact us and how do they change, and what can this result and mean for our future? Building this bridge is a major challenge. Interdisciplinary thinking does not result on its own. We have to focus on our day-to-day business, but this is the real challenge, the way I see it anyway, in dealing with uncertainty. We have to continue with the further training of our managers. We have to dare to teach more theory at universities. We have to set the philosophical bases, and we also have to focus on the recruiting policies in many companies. These have to be adapted because it's not only a question of having an optimized CV, study quickly, do lots of internships, have lots of hands-on experience. Today, it's much more important to have people who are different. They have different experience. They can help us to reflect on unclear situations. And I think this brings us full circle because with CONVOCO, Corinna, this is exactly what you're concerned with. Different models for thinking, different models, and bringing different people together so that you can have an interdisciplinary discussion. So that's why I'm happy to be with you here today. The outcome and how to deal with uncertainty. Now, let me say one thing. What we need is optimism because uncertainty gives us an opportunity above everything else because you can see that all sorts of possibilities can result. So that's why I know many of you are familiar with this already, but my favorite quote is by Winston Churchill. A pessimist is and an optimist, you can see an opportunity in every opportunity. Thank you very much.